Okay, well, congratulations to all the survivors who have made it through to the fourth day, and thank you. Thank you for being here. What I'd like to do before we actually get into a discussion is to provide a kind of big picture view of how we see this conference operating, what kind of role we see it playing. This will be kind of an elaboration on the brief remarks I made Thursday night in the opening session. Maybe the first thing that I should say is that I think it would be useful to recognize that when the humanities and the sciences are brought together, there is often a kind of uneasiness about relative status, a jockeying for position. On the part of us humanists, there is often a sense that we need to prove our worth, that we need to measure up to the status of the sciences in some way. The scientists sometimes see us as dilettantes who are a nuisance rather than contributing anything useful. What I'd like to suggest is that we pull back from the competition that does exist at some level and think rather of ourselves in terms not of one party being in service to or subordinate to another, but both of us being in service to people. That both science and the humanities exist for the purpose of helping people to live better. The humanities don't exist to serve science in any way. Science doesn't exist to serve the humanities. We're both engaged in a common cause, a common struggle. And in various ways, each can contribute to the other's role in this struggle. There are different kinds of relationships that can prevail in different projects. What we're focusing on here in this conference and with the ongoing initiative that I'll be describing a bit later is using the sciences to advance the humanities. That's not the only possible relationship. There are other very valid relationships, but that's what this project is. And that's what this conference was designed to promote, to help to answer the question of why the humanities, why they matter, why should anyone concern themselves with the humanities if they're not already inclined to do so. We think that the neurosciences provide very useful means for helping to answer that question, and that going forward, pursuing this route can yield important dividends, particularly, as I said at the outset on Thursday, dividends in terms of human flourishing, social justice, and so on. So, advancing the humanities, once again, the first point to recognize is that there are several different types of advancement of the humanities that are in play here. Right? And the most fundamental type, which the other forms of advancement, I would argue, are or at least should be in service to, is maximizing the personal and social benefits that the humanities actually deliver to people. This, I would argue, requires increasing our understanding of what the possible benefits are. That's another mode of advancement of knowledge concerning what the humanities are capable of doing. To the extent that we understand what is possible with the humanities, what kinds of benefits they're capable of delivering, we still have to figure out what the most effective mode of delivery or practices of engagement with the humanities might be. These include consumption practices, which those of us as teachers direct powerfully in one way or another through the humanities artifacts that we basically require our students to engage with, as well as through the modes of engagement that we require from them. And it is no doubt the case that some artifacts and some modes of engagement are more effective than others for certain groups of students if one wishes to provide certain benefits. So we need to understand as much as possible about that. Production practices also. I think of Angus Fletcher's talk last night. He's very much engaged in production practices and trying to change those practices in Hollywood. A project that, if it succeeds, could have very profound benefits of the sort that he talked about very brilliantly last night. And then a fourth mode of advancement or type of advancement is increasing public support for humanities education and other types of engagement. Because if we come back to the point that we want to maximize the benefits of the humanities, the more public support we have for the humanities, the more engagement is possible within the education system, for example, but also beyond in various ways. And these various types of advancement reinforce each other, right? More public support for the humanities means more support for research of the type we're talking about, which then produces a greater understanding of what the benefits are, so on and so forth. There are synergies among these four types of advancement. So then the question becomes, how do we do this? How do we proceed if this is the goal that we want to achieve? And at one level, I think the answer is pretty simple and pretty obvious. It's through research that answers several basic questions. And we've seen at this conference multiple examples of this type of research. I won't go into detail now. Those of you who have been here for the past 3.5 days can pull up multiple examples, no doubt, from your memory. But I think it's important to note, too, that these basic questions are often not posed explicitly. We engage in research that provides some answers to them, but we rarely pose the questions explicitly. And I think it's valuable to do that because when we don't, our activity that might serve to answer these questions can very easily get diverted away from answers and caught up in the ruts of traditional practice, which in many cases don't engage the questions, much less answer them. So the first question, as I've already indicated, I think, is what are the benefits that the humanities are capable of providing? We can all bring to mind a number of benefits that have been discussed here. We've heard about, there's evidence that engaging with literature, for example, may enhance empathy, social perspective taking, possibly mind reading, although there are questions about each of these. There are, I would wager, additional benefits that have not been discussed here and perhaps that no one has really thought of yet. So to pose the question, I think, opens up additional possibilities for gaining the kind of understanding that is critical for advancing the benefits that the humanities might provide. I would further say that the benefits are of two basic types. There are personal benefits and there are social benefits. Right? If engagement with the humanities enhances empathy, perspective taking, that's clearly a social benefit. It's less clearly, but I would also suggest also a profound personal benefit. I think there's good evidence for that as well. I won't elaborate here. Personal benefits of the humanities, we can think of some obvious short-term benefits. A good book or a movie or a television show is like a good drink after a hard day, and perhaps healthier in some respects, although maybe not. But I'll suggest in a minute, I think we need to pursue this question a bit further. The personal and social benefits, as I said on Thursday, whatever benefits the humanities are capable of producing, I think are reducible to enhanced neurocognitive functioning. We can talk about that, argue about that later if you like, but I'm going to assert that right now. In the first instance, the humanities can have whatever impact they have as humanities. I mean, they also function in various ways in the general economy as capital, as commodities, and so on. But as humanity, as the humanities, they have whatever effect they have through affecting the brain, the mind, in some way. And I would further suggest that it's the lasting effects that are the most important, rather than the immediate and perhaps just transient effects. They can be important too. Again, you know, a good drink after a hard day doesn't last forever, but it's sure great while it lasts. And the same thing can work for humanities engagement, a good book, a film. But I think and everyone who engages with humanities is familiar with those kinds of benefits. What we understand less and need to understand much more about is the more lasting benefits. And these benefits are enhancements of neurocognitive functions, a change in capability and traits, if you will, rather than temporary states. And more specifically, the major benefits are the enhancement of neurocognitive functions that enable personal flourishing, responsible global citizenship, and social justice, I would maintain. These benefits depend on social cognition, that is, our capabilities of understanding other people, judging them accurately, adequately, justly, and also on our identity, our self-concept, our sense of self. There has been less research and less discussion of the identity component here at this conference, but I know both Keith Oatley and David Meal have done interesting research that talks about how literature, for example, engages emotions in ways that, at least in the short term, can change a person's sense of who they are. So both of these possibilities, I think, have the potential to yield major benefits. So the question then is, what are the specific neurocognitive capabilities and habits that constitute optimal social cognition and an optimal identity or sense of self? How do we go about answering a question like this? Well, we have, first of all, evidence from science, and a lot of that evidence has been brought forward in this conference, I think. Work on empathy, stereotypes, dehumanization, violence, altruism, self-identity as well, I would suggest, provide good insights into what some of these capabilities are. And then we also have the humanities as a source of this. Looking at the particular forms and contents and consumption practices of various humanities artifacts. I think here, once again, of Angus Fletcher's book on Hamlet and his work on free and direct discourse that he discussed last night. He also has an article on this, looking at particular literary forms and asking what general need of this society at the time is being met by these forms, and working back from that to some really fascinating conclusions, I think. Let me provide an example now of how this procedure, I think, might work. And this is a way of kind of sneaking in a little report of research we're doing here at Kent State with the Social Cognition Research Group. which is really the work that gave rise to this conference. We realized that we had bitten off a pretty big chunk of the apple, and we needed a lot of help trying to chew it and digest it. So we figured hold a conference, bring the top minds in, and get some help. So the example of the, first of all, the cognitive or neurocognitive capability that we focused on, one of them, there were several, the example I'll use here, is the ability to recognize how forces beyond people's control determine their character traits, their actions, and their life outcomes. Another way of talking about this is that a crucial capability is to overcome a very widespread half-truth, or what I'll call a myth here, about the human condition, which I'll name the myth of self-determination. More technically, I've referred to this as the autonomy schema. The myth of self-determination, or the autonomy schema, has it that people are essentially autonomous in relation to external forces, that their behavior, their life outcomes, and their character traits are determined by the individuals themselves, with external forces playing little or no role in determining these things. To put it graphically, the assumption is character determines behavior, determines life outcomes. Another way of referring to this myth or this schema is the American dream, the American myth, as it's also been called, because this schema, research has shown, is more dominant in the West, and particularly in America, than in certain Eastern cultures. Right? And the way we arrived at targeting this particular, in this case, lack of capability, right? Deficiency, I would say, certainly bias in social cognition, was again twofold: through science, work done in cognitive psychology on the fundamental attribution error, which has been mentioned here, on essentialism, which has also been mentioned, Bastian and Haslam, and also on implicit person theories. Carol Dweck's work, Sherry Levy, Jason Plax, and some other folks. The fundamental attribution error, for example, was called at one time the most robust finding in social psychology. Think of Stanley Milgram's experiments, the very problematic but also very revealing Stanford Prison experiments, Darley and Batson's Good Samaritan experiments, and lots of others as well. This is well established. Interestingly, at the same time as I was looking through this, going through the cognitive psychological research on this, I began reading protest novels, some of which I'd never read before, and found that, lo and behold, they were targeting this same tripartite assumption. So that suggested there's a convergence, both the literary, I'm thinking first of all of that really brilliant intuitive psychologist, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who arrived at these insights before psychology as a discipline even existed. Her book and the others that are listed here, you can go through and find them identifying, targeting, and trying to undermine the fundamental attribution error, essentialism, and so on. So let me elaborate a little bit. Why target the autonomy schema or this myth? Well, because of the harmful consequences that have also been well established through empirical research, as well as through representation in these protest novels, I would say. The harmful cognitive consequences are that this mindset cuts off half of the at least half of the picture. External determinants of behavior, character, and life outcomes are ignored or discounted. Individuals are themselves deemed to be solely responsible for either their good or their bad behaviors, character traits, and life outcomes. The harmful personal consequences of this mindset are a hyper-individualism, where individuals who believe this generally, have this assumption about human beings generally, tend to themselves harbor unachievable ego ideals of self-reliance and self-sufficiency, which cause, think of traditional masculinity ideals in this country. Also much written about and discussed. Unjustifiable self-blame follows from this. Studies have shown that this ideology is so powerful in this country that many people who have been crushed under the boot of capitalism from birth blame themselves for their lack of success. And on the other hand, unjustifiable pride, arrogance, and indifference to others who are less fortunate. People who look down on other people who are poor or who wind up in prison as somehow inferior to themselves, rather than just less fortunate. If you're of a philosophical bent, what I'm talking about here is the phenomenon of moral luck. And if you want a brilliant book on this, read Against Moral Responsibility by a philosopher just down the road at Youngstown State named Bruce Waller. The social consequences. Right? Further neglecting and punishing people who have already been victimized by forces beyond their control, right? And further idolizing and rewarding people who have already benefited from forces beyond their control. So what this comes to is that the capability that we need to develop in order to enhance personal flourishing as well as socially responsible action, social justice, is a situationism schema, a mindset that directs cognition, information processing, at every juncture when we are passing some sort of judgment on another person, a mindset that directs us not just to the person, but to the question of the forces beyond that person that have brought that person to this position. A homeless person, for example. People see a homeless person, a person panhandling along the road. Many think, a drunken derelict or a druggie or a self-indulgent this or that, rather than thinking, maybe catastrophic medical bills, maybe mental illness, maybe a collapsing economy that made employment impossible, things like that. The situation, as who was it? Heider maybe said that behavior captures the field of perception. We see the person, we can't see the person's situation, so our very cognitive architecture is in one sense biasing us to name the actor the sole cause of the action. And so it takes some training for anyone, and particularly in a culture like ours, which instead of pushing back against the bias, pushes it along further. It takes training to step back and be able to, if not detect, at least to imagine, infer, suppose what situation might have been in play with regard to a person's life outcomes, a person's behavior, and a person's character. One way of putting this regarding character is the old joke, the most important decision a person ever makes is the choice of one's parents. Right? that kind of underlines just how little control we have over the type of person we are. And those of us, all of us in here who are wonderful people, couldn't be better, rather than dislocating an elbow or shoulder, it's important to recognize that we're here because of all kinds of luck, starting from the luck of birth, and that people who didn't make it this far in life or who wind up in a bad place many times are unlucky from birth, or at least in some place along the route from birth. So the judgments then produced by the situationism schema, the basic one is circumstances play a major role in all success, good behavior, and good character, and also a major role in all failure and bad behavior and bad character. And this recognition in turn, and you can look at Bernard Wiener's work on causal attribution and social responsibility for all kinds of empirical studies of this. Christine Reyna also has done very interesting studies of how the fundamental attribution error is embedded in many stereotypes as what she calls the attributional signature of a stereotype. And actually, recent research on stereotypes has emphasized that what's really harmful about stereotypes is not so much the misattribution of certain traits to people who don't have them, because in some cases there is a grain of truth. Some people do have those traits. The really harmful thing about stereotypes, one of the harmful things, is the causes to which these traits are attributed. Think of Virginia Woolf's argument in A Room of One's Own. Women belittled for lacking intelligence because, name two great women philosophers, right, back then. And of course, her point was, you got to look at the circumstances that women were born into, raised, and so on. Conversely, successful and wealthy people are legitimately to be envied and expected to help others rather than being idolized, given a pass. Rich people in this country are idolized. We're fascinated by them. And the phenomenon of the widening gap between rich and poor, the fact that sociologists have commented on, that there isn't more outrage, is involved here. And the reason there isn't more outrage is because there's somewhere a fundamental assumption that they deserve this wealth. They worked hard for it, must have, right? The assumption is if you're successful, if you're wealthy, you must have. If you remember Herman Cain, the Republican presidential candidate, in his interview with the editorial board of Boston newspaper, was it, said to the Occupy Wall Street protesters, if you aren't rich, if you don't have a job, don't blame Wall Street, blame yourself. And that was taken as a truism by a lot of people in this country. So this is the type of judgment that the situationism schema operates against. And then again, poor people and criminals should be given sympathy and assistance, not blame and punishment, which, by the way, doesn't mean you just open the gates of the prison and let everybody run loose and do what they want. And again, Bruce Waller's book is great on this. There are other things on moral luck that also make this point. So that's an example then of a cognitive capability that we've identified coming both from literature and from neurocognitive social psychology that is very important to develop. If you can develop a situationism schema in people, they are better off themselves, and everybody else, the rest of the planet, is also better off. All right? So the next question then, once you identify a cognitive capability that's worth nurturing, developing through the humanities, how does that cognitive capability get developed if it's not already there? What can we do to bring it about? What specific cognitive activities are most effective in developing these optimal neurocognitive capabilities and habits? Here again, we can look both to science and to the humanities. In the present example that I'm talking about, we looked at studies of learning, studies of brain development, and also at literature on therapeutic change. In particular, literature on schema therapy and the role of schemas in deep learning. Deep learning involves not just the acquisition of information or knowledge, but the development of schemas, scripts, mindsets that change the way we automatically process information about the world and about ourselves. From the humanities, looking at the form, the content, and the consumption practices of various humanities artifacts, literary texts, films, and so on, for example. So let me try to move a bit more quickly here. What we found was that both the scientific and the literary practices involve some common activities. One is explicitly correcting faulty implicit theories. John Steinbeck, for example, in The Grapes of Wrath, has one of his little interchapters that begins by saying that there's one thing that the great owners don't understand about what's going on in the country with the Great Depression, the migration out of the Midwest to California. They don't understand, he says, that all of this disruption and the people who are moving from Oklahoma to California are results, not causes. Results, not causes. He says it 3 times. Results, not causes. He's beating the reader over the head. Said, pay attention, this is important, right? That's his point here. He is addressing an implicit theory explicitly. He's correcting it there. Also, practicing more adequate information processing routines like expectation, attention, inference, supposition. Again, the protest novels that I listed earlier engage readers in that. They lead us through paying attention to the sorts of things that in real life we don't have access to immediately and so don't think of, don't pay attention to. In Native Son, for example, if you remember when Bigger Thomas is going to the Daltons to try to land this job as their chauffeur, for most white people, even today, reading that novel, imagine, here's Bigger walking to the Daltons' house. They would think, oh, uneventful, he'll get there, he'll talk to them and get the job or won't. Wright takes us through how at every step, Bigger is terrified. He's terrified first when he enters the neighborhood that he's going to be arrested for suspicion of intentions to rape or murder someone, right? Then he gets to the house and he thinks he's got to go to the back door because he's a black man in a white neighborhood and you don't go to the front door of a big house like this. You go to the back door, can't find the back door. He's terribly anxious. So he goes to the front, rings the doorbell, and he hears a sound that he's never heard before, probably a boom, and he thinks, damn, I've broken the doorbell. Now I've lost the job. White woman comes to the door, holds it open, not quite wide enough for him to safely pass without potentially brushing up against him, or his brushing up against her. And he's terrified at that thought, right? And remember, Emmett Till was mid-1950s. This is before Emmett Till. This is in the 30s that this novel is taking place. So he is literally in fear of his life at some level. He could be, he knows, he could be lynched for something like this. And then it goes on and on. The point is that what Wright does, and what all of these novels do in one way or another, is to lead us through directing our attention towards situational determinants of behavior, of emotion, and hence of action. It's no accident that Wright calls the first book of Native Son Fear. and that he documents systematically and rigorously the various kinds of threats that Bigger is faced with at every step, including physical threats, social, political threats, and emotional, psychological threats. So, additionally then, acquiring more adequate exemplars, which get a critical mass, become a prototype, a template for viewing people in general or particular types of people. What Wright is doing is providing in Bigger Thomas a radically alternative exemplar who can be a prototype for the worst stereotype that white people have about black people, right? And Wright himself was castigated for making Bigger Thomas the protagonist of this novel. You know, people said, you know, you're just reinforcing the stereotype that white people have of black people. That all young black males are, you know, the black male atheist, murderer, rapist. I mean, that's who Bigger is in behavior. And Wright does that deliberately, as he says in How Bigger Was Born, the essay he wrote shortly afterward. You know, he wants to demonstrate to people that Bigger Thomas is not who he is because he's a black man or a man of African descent, as the newspapers all point out. He is the way he is because he's a native son. He's a product of a white supremacist society. So this is a dramatic, a powerful exemplar that if students, for example, can get their heads around it and lock that in their memory as an exemplar of, and Wright said there are millions of Biggers out there of all nationalities and races, you know, of any criminal, of any badass, right? This is the prototype. That changes everything. Instead of fearing, hating, wanting to exterminate people like that, you feel compassion for them and the impulse to help. So that's an example, and then developing metacognition I won't go into. Then, once we can identify practices that we think at least engage, or rather activities that we think develop these key capabilities, the question is, what are the best humanities practices for engaging people in these kind of cognitive training activities? And this involves, you know, devising or identifying engagement practices in field of education, courses, curricula, pedagogical strategies, assignment, and so on that elicit these activities, and then measuring their effectiveness in producing the desired neurocognitive development. And so here again, a quick example. You know, trying to develop situationist processing through literary study. You know, you select texts that do the sort of thing that I'm describing here. That's optimal. It doesn't have to be these texts. You can do this with just about any novel, for example. But some are easier to work with than others. Directed reading, we're always choosing in one way or another, even if we leave the choice supposedly to students, what books students read. So you know, we are also always directing their reading, implicitly if not explicitly. You know, they learn to figure out what we're looking for, what we want them to focus on when they're reading. So the question is, you know, if we want to develop situationist processing, what do we want them to focus on? There are all kinds of things that people focus on in literature classes. Maybe focusing on the syntactic forms, styles, and so on is not optimal for this goal, for example. Focused discussion as well. What do we engage our students in talking about in class? Research assignments, writing assignments, and exam design. And I can elaborate on this later. I won't belabor the point now. And then we measure the effectiveness. So the question is, what are the best ways of measuring the effectiveness of different practices in developing certain cognitive capabilities? Well, one thing you need, I think is pretty obvious, you need control groups. That is, you need to measure a group of individuals who have undergone, shall we say, this intervention, and then a group that has not, trying to control as much as you can, difficult in an academic setting, for all the other variables. You also need a longitudinal design, ideally. And this is something that's worth thinking about a little bit. This was brought up in one of the sessions earlier. Most of the studies that have been done of the kind of change that leads to better social outcomes, like empathy, perspective taking, and so on, are testing relatively short-term effects. These may be the result of things like priming. All right? Although there have been studies done of empathy, for example, that suggest something more than that's going on. Daniel Batson, for example, found in one of his studies that there was actually a kind of sleeper effect regarding attitudes toward severe offenders. Found that tested immediately after the intervention, which was reading a short passage about this supposed offender. Immediately after that intervention, there was resistance to compassion or to any kind of positive feelings toward this class of people. But a couple weeks later, an assessment that was designed in such a way as to make the subjects think there was no relation to the intervention 2 weeks earlier, found that among those who had undergone this intervention, there was a significant increase in compassion and generosity, impulse to help the criminals, the drug dealer or the murderer. Right? So, and that's only 2 weeks. And ideally, we would want a longitudinal design that would test the long-term effects of these. That's something that is more aspirational than actual now, but I think it's important. And then third, I would say that ideally we would try to measure not just perceptions, judgments, and attitudes, which again is what the majority of the studies to date have done, but also behavior in some way. That's tricky, but not impossible. There are research paradigms that have done that in one form or another, and particularly for the sort of thing we're talking about, voting in a democracy is a pretty important behavior, and you can actually engage students in a very real form of voting in certain experimental designs, right, about who to give money to and how much, for example, real money, right? And finally, neurocognitive processing. It's important to, I think, try to test neurocognitive processing at the same time as you test perceptions, judgments, and attitudes, and also behavior, particularly if you're doing a longitudinal study. I mean, what we're trying to do here with our project is to test students at the beginning of the semester and at the end of the semester with a questionnaire that's designed, that's based loosely on extant instruments like Fegan's poverty scale, which goes way back, Sims's, part of Sims's criminality scale, some Bastian and Haslam essentialism scale, Johannes Keller's essentialism, and some other things. Pre and post testing, beginning of semester, end of semester. What we found was in our pilot studies some significant movement in the desired direction. With some of the subscales there were reliability issues, so we've reworked those now. And we're also trying to add an EEG component to this study, which would, we hope, indicate when students engage at the end of the semester in more situationist processing and judgments, do we see a greater activation in certain regions of interest in the brain that have been established by other studies, neurological brain imaging studies, as the neural substrate of situationist judgments, that sort of thing. Or are students just thinking, I know what they're looking for. You know, the social desirability or the impact of the design of the instrument. To the extent that we can identify the nature of the processing that results in a certain judgment or perception, we're better able to design interventions that maximize the development of this, this cognitive capability. Then this next step is instituting and refining effective practices. If you find something that works, you try to apply it more systematically, and discontinuing or modifying ineffective practices. Moving quickly then, using empirical findings to advance the public's understanding and valuation of the humanities. So this is fairly simple: explaining, disseminating, publicizing evidence of the benefits. Right? And finally then, to do all this work, we need an infrastructure. You know, we can have conferences like this, we can individually pursue different research projects, but ideally, to make this really take hold, we need some kind of infrastructure to reproduce these efforts on a continuous basis. And more specifically, scholars need an infrastructure that provides them with knowledge, institutional support of various sorts, and psychological incentives, various kinds of knowledge of humanities artifacts, of possible and actual practices of their consumption and production, of the neurocognitive structures and processes, so on and so forth. Also institutional support, and then not insignificantly psychological incentives, maybe most of all various forms of recognition of the sort that one gets most profoundly when one does research that actually makes a difference in people's lives. That's the big one: recognition from the real. Recognition, by the way, has been described by both philosophers and psychologists as the psychological oxygen that we all need in order to survive. And it's, again, there's a very large body of empirical evidence that supports this. That what we need most of all is a sense of ourselves as a force that matters in the world. And we get that in all sorts of ways. There is explicit recognition of people, you know, just acknowledging the other's presence, of praising other people, of even criticizing or being aggressive toward other people is a form of recognition, as psychologists studying childhood trauma recognize. They've noted that neglect is often more traumatic than abuse, because abuse, at least you're the target of someone's attention. One school shooter who was in prison told an interviewer, "I'd rather be wanted for murder than not wanted at all." So recognition is important for all of us, and we get it from various social institutions and structures. If you have a job, that's big. Society is recognizing that you matter, that you know. If you don't have a job, studies showing that when people lose their job, particularly men, all kinds of psychological and physical problems often ensue, right? So what we need to think about is how we provide various forms of recognition for people to do this kind of work rather than continuing maybe in the well-trodden paths, I would call them ruts, of disciplinary research practices. To move out of those ruts and try to do something that matters. Try to do something that one way or another will contribute to the ultimate effort of making people's lives better, helping people live better, both in the sense of being more fulfilled and being better people, better co-inhabitants of the planet. So our effort to do this here at Kent State is to establish the Institute for the Advancement of the Humanities, which is an idea that is only a few months old. What, 4 months, David? But that has taken hold in a remarkable and amazingly gratifying way, thanks to David and to Dean Blank and lots of other people, including our provost, himself a humanist, and a lot of staff people. What we're hoping to do with the Institute is to provide various forms of support for the kind of research that I've outlined here today. These are some of the things that we hope to be doing on an ongoing basis. This conference is kind of a prototype for an event that we hope will be regular, if not every year, maybe every other year. Also summer institutes, research institutes for scholars who are either beginning their careers in the humanities or scholars who are interested in retooling, as it were, established scholars. Summer institutes for teachers, both university and school teachers, who would like to learn more about the scientific evidence supporting the value of the humanities and also indicating best practices for delivering those values, and so on and so forth. I've run, I apologize, longer than I intended, so I'll stop now and love to get feedback from all of you on anything, everything that I've laid out here. So.